All right. We have our next two speakers are very near and dear to my heart. Dr. Susan Palacios and Ashley Kintzer are doing the Lord's work. They are off and running at TJJD, Texas Juvenile Justice Institutional Division, but also with a mind to the entire system of making one juvenile justice system. So we're hearing a lot from how we can work with children in a preventive manner, upstream, keeping them shallow in the juvenile justice system. But these two wonderful people are doing great work in the system for children. In 2015, the 84th Texas Legislature mandated the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, TJJD, to collaborate with local juvenile probation departments in adopting a regionalization plan, prioritizing proximity to home, go figure, over commitment to a state facility. In this presentation, we hope to enhance understanding of the process and highlight its positive impact on justice-involved youth. Our speakers are Dr. Susan Palacios, the Community Mental Health Program Administrator for TJJD, and Ashley Kintzer, the Director of Probation at TJJD. Please welcome Dr. Palacios and Ashley. Welcome.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to be here. We were excited that we were invited to be the grand finale of the event, so I feel like that's pretty special. But we also know you guys want to get out of here and get on the road, so we will get to it. A little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to do a little bit of discussion about diversion opportunities that exist. Like you, our main goal is to keep kids as shallow in the system as possible, out of the system if possible, but as shallow in the justice system as possible if they happen to enter the system. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Ashley's going to go into detail about some regional diversion alternatives that we have, and I'll talk a little bit about those in the community and what that looks like. Because our goal is, even though our state facilities are doing incredible work, our goal is to keep kids out of those as much as possible and to keep them in their communities and in their homes. And then we'll talk a little bit about resources in the field and the importance of getting those established for our kids as soon as possible. So the way that the probation departments are divided up, probation and parole, is we have seven different regions within the state. And the probation departments themselves kind of helped create these regions. I realize that they're different than the regions that other agencies have, and sometimes that can be confusing. But this is how the probation and parole departments are divided. Each one of the probation and parole departments has a regional county program administrator who's a TJJD employee who lives within that region and helps support the probation departments in that region as they try to create programs and keep kids as shallow in the system as possible and continue to do great work with the kids that are on probation and in facilities. So they're kind of the go-to support person from the state for each of those departments. And it's unique because they live within that region, so they really have their finger on the pulse of what is happening in that area and the climate of that area and how to help, connect kids with resources when they're available in those areas. So that's their contact information, and we can get all of that to you. So why is diversion important? Why is it important to keep kids as shallow in the system as possible? Why is it important to keep them out of the juvenile justice system if possible? And I think that that's because we all recognize that kids do well if they can, right? The Ross Greene quote, kids do well if they can. And if they can't, it's important that we adults step in and figure out what the barriers are. I don't believe that we have kids who are just not making good choices, right? Because if kids had the ability to make a good choice, they would make a good choice. I don't think kids wake up in the morning and say, I'm really going to mess it up today. I'm going to make poor choices and not be a successful human, right? They don't do that. They wake up with good intentions, but something gets in the way. And a lot of the time, especially for our kids, what gets in the way is trauma. So whether that's trauma in utero or trauma once they have entered the world, trauma is a significant factor with our kids. And one thing that's often overlooked is that in utero trauma and how that impacts our kids and their brain development. Whether that be lack of proper nutrition for the mom, whether that be access to prenatal care, whether it's exposure to different substances in the womb, or if it's just the cortisol levels. There are a lot of studies right now that suggest and have actually found that high cortisol levels are linked with brain development and issues with brain development for our children. So we have these little babies who are essentially stewing in high cortisol levels, and then they come out and they see the world differently because their brains are different, right? They have neurotypical differences. They're not neurotypical, they have differences. So what is it with these children that have neurodivergence? What are we seeing that creates the reason that we need to divert them as soon as possible? What we see as criminal behavior at the end often begins as a trauma response for our kids. So figuring out where that response is coming from and what need is there. So I also am a firm believer in the philosophy that children who are not doing well either have an underdeveloped skill or an unmet need. So figuring out what is the skill that they're lacking or what is the need that they have, and then how do we meet that need or help develop that skill. Very often, I'm so glad they were speaking about special education services prior to this, because so often we have children, it starts in the school, right? Or prior to school or in the school. They have an unmet need or an underdeveloped skill. They get into the school system, and sometimes they're met with punitive punishments that don't meet the need or develop the skill. So then they just continue to struggle. And then the struggles get greater, and then they get larger. And as they get larger, what one time might have been seen as a tantrum or a meltdown is now an offense, right? So you have these kids who have not had those needs met early on, and then they end up in our system. So helping identify early, when we have a kid who has sensory needs, whether that's a sensory aversion or they have some type of sensory seeking behaviors, figuring out how they can meet those in an appropriate way when they're little is so important. Figuring out if they have that underdeveloped skill, how do we help them develop that skill, whether that's self-soothing, whether that's being able to, sit with uncomfortable emotions. What is the skill that they need to develop when they're little so that they don't have these problems when they're older? And often I find that it's the ability and expectation discrepancy, right? A lot of our kids, especially with that prenatal trauma and kids who have abuse and neglect, we know that the brain of a child who's been abused or neglected is different than the brain of a child who's been raised in a loving, secure home. So they might look on the outside like a typical kid who should be able to follow the rules, right? So the expectation is that they will follow the rules. They will sit in the group. They will do what they need to do, but they're not meeting that expectation. So sometimes that's seen as a willful choice, right? They're just not choosing to do well. And that is where we end up with a cycle. There's an African proverb that I just love, and I feel it's so applicable for our kids. And that is that children who do not feel embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And I think that that is so true for our kids, because oftentimes these behaviors that we see, these children have been shamed or they have had these punitive punishments, and a kid never does better if they feel worse, right? So it's so important that we get in there and we try to divert these kids, keep them in the communities, find ways to help the community support them. And if, in fact, they can't stay in the community and also have community safety, then we escalate, right? But we really want to try our best to keep them as shallow as possible. So some ways that we do that are the grants continuation of services. So we at TJJD provide grants for our probation departments. And those can look like a number of things. I'm going to put it all up here. From kids who are not in the system at all, we provide grants for prevention and intervention programs for our departments throughout the state. And this looks different depending on the department, right? They come to us and they say, we have this idea, right? And they ask for this grant funding to do this idea. And sometimes this is an after-school program. Sometimes this is something within the school. Sometimes this is in the community. Just figuring out a way that they can really connect with these kids and help them before they even get a referral. So that's pre-referral. Post-referral are going to be our community projects that are working with kids who have already had some type of interaction with our system. Under all of this also is the Special Needs Diversionary Program, and that's with our youth with mental illness, and we fund probation officers who work specifically with that caseload to just make sure that their needs are being met. We also have residential projects, and Ashley's going to get into this a little bit more, but the residential projects and the regional diversion alternatives are both ways that our kids are getting a little bit further into the system. They're needing a placement outside of the home. And how can we make sure that those needs are met in the least restrictive placement possible? We have the residential projects, we have a few post-adjudication programs throughout the state, and the state is paying for beds for those programs, right? So youth that need those, we will pay for a certain number of beds that can be provided to those youth that are a little bit deeper in the system. And then Ashley will go in depth about the regional diversion alternatives and how you can link to those. And those are children who are eligible for TJJD commitment, and this is kind of the last-ditch effort to keep them out of that facility. Okay. All right, so what are some community options? The local mental health authority and the local intellectual and developmental disability authority is usually the first stop for our kids. The reason I bring this up, and I will bring this up every single time you see me, is because there's often a misunderstanding about who goes to which entity, right? So it's so important. I see a lot of psychologicals come across my desk, and I'll read the psychological and I'll see, okay, this kid has autism and a 60 IQ, and he has been served with the local mental health authority for 10 years, and he's not getting anywhere. Of course he's not getting anywhere. That's not the appropriate service for him. He would likely need services from the local intellectual developmental disability authority, the LIDA. I worked at a local mental health authority for several years. I've worked at 2, and I did not know what the LIDA was when I worked there. So this is a common situation where they don't know what the other side of the house is able to do, right? And they're not referring sometimes because they don't know to. They have great intentions. They're trying to serve this kid the best way they can, but they're not aware, right? And sometimes our probation departments will call and they will end up on one side of the house when they really need to be with the other program. So making sure that if you see a kid come across your desk that has a suspected intellectual or developmental disability, that you get them with the LIDA as soon as possible to get some assessments done and see if they're eligible. It's so important they have those done before their 18th birthday, so that they can have those transition services into adulthood. So that is very important. They're different things and serve different purposes. Sequential intercept mapping, our HHSC partners are doing some amazing work with that, and they're going into the communities and finding resources that are available in the communities and linking those together, right? So they're making sure that they're speaking. The community resource coordination groups also does very similar work in that they go in and they make sure that we have all the resources on the table for this kid. The sequential intercept mapping is going a little bit deeper into finding those resources, and the CRCGs are really good at connecting with those resources once you need them. And some are more robust than others. I know some communities, I mentioned the CRCG and they're like, we don't have one, or ours isn't real great. Some of them are awesome and doing incredible work, and some still need a little work to build up to that level, but they're a real great opportunity for our families to really get what they need. And then school support services, I loved the presentation before. So often it's intimidating for families to reach out to the school for help. There's a lot of lingo. You know, I have a Ph.D. and I navigate systems for a living. I have a first grader and I'm completely overwhelmed by the school system and the 504 process and the ARDS and like what minutes mean. It's a lot, right? And I know these systems. So for parents that aren't familiar with the systems, it's incredibly intimidating. So letting them know you can request an ARD at any time and you guys can have these discussions about what your child needs to make sure they're supported in the school. Okay, and then once the community is no longer an option for our kid, what are some options for diversion before we go into regional diversion? One would be the CRCG. Although they primarily focus on placements within the, or services within the community, they can also assist with placements. They can help if a child needs to go to Waco Center for Youth or a state hospital. They can help with that referral process. They can also help just bringing more people to the table who might have knowledge of a placement that might be appropriate. HHSC has great programs. They have the residential bed project, which is great. Some of our justice-involved youth require a level of care that is not available through that program at this time, but some of our youth have been able to be placed through there. So they are also a great option. And I know legislatively they have funding for several more things that are going to be coming down the pike to help with that. The school, what a lot of people are not aware of is that if the school determines in the ARD committee, if they determine that a child needs a placement outside of the home or outside of the school, they have funds available to assist with that or cover that. And if they don't have them at the local level, they can apply for them at the state level. So that's incredibly important that they loop in the school in all of these decisions. Our probation departments have funding and they place kids through the probation departments, whether that be a private facility or whether that is a non-secure or secure post-adjudication. They have all of those as well. And then, as I mentioned, the beds that we're funding. And then Ashley will talk about regional diversion alternatives.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about regionalization. Regionalization got up and running in 2016. The original team that made up the regionalization team were 3 individuals. We had 2 regional county program administrators that were full-time, 1 part-time regional, and me. I was a planner at that time. And so unfortunately, we didn't have the funding to grow it out into what it is today. Now we're up to 7 regionals across the state. We have 1 regional in each of the regions, like Susan pointed out with the map. Along with the manager, Deborah Harris is the manager over that division. And then they also get assistance from Dr. Palacios and Amanda Britton. Those are our 2 mental health professionals that work within the probation division, and they assist us with diversion applications as needed. So as was brought up at the beginning, regionalization became a part of TYC or TJJD back in 2016. With our first diversions, when we got up and running, we were able to divert 21 youth. Our goal was to divert 30 youth, but it was very challenging because we were trying to figure out, once a child gets approved for diversion funding, that child doesn't always go to the placement that we have approved. And we'll talk about that a little bit through this presentation about how we got better at diverting youth. But ultimately, it's the judiciary who's responsible for either committing the child or placing the child in the diversion placement that the child was approved for. So in some instances, diversion is approved for the child, but the judge thinks that it's more appropriate for the child to be committed or to go to a different placement, or maybe even go back into the community. And so in those instances, we don't count those children because ultimately they weren't diverted using RDA funding. As the years passed, the LBB quickly realized that we were able to divert more than they expected. So in the 2nd and 3rd year of diversion, our goal was 150, to divert 150 youth over the course of 1 fiscal year. We wound up diverting over 200. One thing that we have recognized is if a child fails placement, that money goes right back into the pot to divert another child. We try to pull as many pennies and nickels and dimes together to divert as many children as possible. So we have really busted the goal every year. The only year that we were unable to meet our goal was in 2020, and that was partially due to COVID, unfortunately. A lot of our placements shut down, courts shut down, and we just weren't able to place those children. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see a couple of documents that were utilized to write the original regionalization plan. That plan was published in 2016 in the summer. We just recently updated the plan, and it was published this past February. But based on sunset recommendations, TJJD just went under sunset review. And for those of you that don't know about sunset, sunset is an agency that determines whether or not state agencies need to continue. And so ultimately, sunset did determine that TJJD needs to continue doing what they're doing, and that regionalization is fantastic, and that we need more funding to divert more kids. So, but another goal that they gave to us was to continue to update that regionalization plan, because obviously services across the state change. Different services come online, post-adjudication facilities come online, and we need to make sure that that plan stays accurate for the probation departments that it's serving. All right, so this is one of my favorite pictures of the continuum of services for youth in juvenile justice. It is a picture that we've used since the very beginning. And ultimately, it just shows where RDA, Regional Diversion Alternatives, fits into the big juvenile justice spectrum. So just like Dr. Palacios talked about earlier, the first intersect for an intervention is P&I. So P&I is for services for kids that haven't even hit the system. This could be a sibling of a child. So maybe big brother, big sister is getting into trouble, and the probation department recognizes that they have a younger sibling that maybe could benefit for an aftercare program. So these are for services prior to any referrals to the Juvenile Justice Department. Then we go a little bit deeper. Supervisionary caution, and then deferred prosecution, and then we go a little deeper. And then we get into formal probation. So for probation for juveniles is very different than it is for adults. Youth can be placed in a post-adjudication secure facility while on formal probation. And this is when RDA kind of comes in. So we utilize RDA to divert children away from state secure placements. So TJJD runs 5 secure state facilities across the state of Texas. And obviously they do wonderful work. But there are some kids that we wanted to catch. You know, maybe that UUMV who's not a violent offender, or maybe a child who's been diagnosed with IDD. Those are children that don't belong in TJJ state secure facilities. So what could we do with those children? Well, RDA is what we can do with those children. And probation departments across the state of Texas submit RDA applications to us. We review them and then determine whether or not a child should be given one last chance for placement or even a community program without being committed to the state. Now, one of the requirements for this particular grant opportunity is the child must have a felony adjudication on his or her record. Now, it could be pending, and the child might be about to go to court, but ultimately, this child needs to be a child that could be committed to the state. And so that was the one caveat that we had to put into place was the child has to have a formal felony referral to be eligible for Regional Diversion Alternatives Program. So this will kind of give you an idea of our priorities for these children. So ultimately, you have the umbrella priority of youth who have a felony referral. But what children are we really wanting to hone in on? So you'll see here, the top ones are all of our priority populations that were in the original plan. And then the last 3 are ones that we added on in this last publication of our plan that was done in February. So you can see here, younger youth. If we get an application for a younger offender between the ages of 10 and 14, then that hits one of our priority check marks. The next one is going to be serious mental health. This was not defined for us. So we utilized Dr. Palacios' expertise to determine what applications do you guys want to review before we approve or deny the application. And so her and Amanda Britton came up with a wonderful list for us. So when we have a child who has recently tried to commit suicide, or had some type of suicidal ideation, or had psychosis, but some really high-level mental health concerns, those applications automatically go to Dr. Palacios for her review to make sure that the facility or the service that we're wanting to provide the child actually meets the child's needs. The next one is going to be youth with some type of intellectual or developmental disability. So if we get that psychological and we determine based on the psychological that this child has been diagnosed with IDD, that child is obviously going to be a priority for diversion. Other youth that we look at are children that score either a low or moderate on the PACT assessment. In the state of Texas, several years ago, the PACT was determined to be the risk and assessment tool to be used to determine children's risk and need. And so one of the documents that we require when a child is applied for a grant, such as RDA, is a copy of the child's PACT assessment. At probation departments across the state, they utilize the PACT to determine what services need to be provided to children, and we use it as well. So if a child hits moderate or low, that child hits our priority list. Another one is the See It. As if you could show your hand or raise your hand, how many of you guys have heard of the See It tool? Okay, so the See It tool is a tool that's used to determine whether or not a child potentially could have been trafficked. It's a tool that went into place several years ago at TJJD, and we're continuing to roll it out in the probation departments across the state. But it's a long survey that a PO, a JPO could utilize and determine, yes, this child does have multiple cell phones. Yes, this child does have a bunch of cash on his or her person. And these are different things that highlight, yes, there's a possibility that this child has been trafficked. If we receive on the application that a child hits those priorities as far as being trafficked, they meet one of our priority populations. Other ones are ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And these are a 1 through 10. So it's just a yes or no question. Has this child experienced this? Yes or no. Had this child had this experience? The higher the ACE score, the higher the child's trauma. So if a child scores 4 or higher, we determine that that child should be a priority to be diverted. And then the last 3 are the ones that we just added. Youth who are parenting or will be parenting. You know, there have been a lot of changes in the state of Texas in the laws and when a child or when an individual can terminate a pregnancy. So what does that mean? We're going to have a lot of more children in our post-adjudication facilities that are pregnant. And we need to make sure that those children are receiving proper services because we all know that handling a child with juvenile justice and trauma exposure is a lot. But now add on that child is pregnant. And there are very few placements across the state that will even take a pregnant child. So we wanted to make sure that we were highlighting that in the plan. Other children, female children. We have definitely determined that little girls to get into the juvenile justice system often experience extreme trauma. Specifically, trafficking, a lot of trafficking. Just recently, I had the opportunity to assist with the transport from Kentucky. We had an I.C.J. kid, and for those of you that don't know about I.C.J., if a child runs away from the state of Texas, even if the child isn't in the juvenile justice system, it's our responsibility to get that child back to Texas. And so we had a little girl who had been trafficked. And ultimately, she wound up in Kentucky because her trafficker took her up there. She was from Harris County. And but visiting with that little girl, it was a lot. She had been trafficked for over a year and experienced terrible, terrible trauma. And so the last place that little girl belongs is at TJJD. So those are specific instances that we want to make sure that we're able to divert those children. And then the last one is older youth who just need either their GED or they need to graduate from high school or they would benefit from some type of vocational program. One thing that I'm constantly preaching with my team at TJJD is we need more opportunities for kids for education and vocational training. Because ultimately, and I will say this over and over again, you can never take away someone's education. You can never take away someone's certification. You know, and when those kids exit out of those programs, they feel pride. They feel excited because they did it. They don't need to depend on their parents anymore because now they have this vocation of welding or plumbing or electrical work or whatever the case may be. And so those are children that we really tried to divert as well. All right, so when we receive an application, what are we looking for? So ultimately, we receive over 300 RDA applications a year. And so what happens is the applications come through our portal, and then the regional, who is responsible for the part of Texas that application came from, then reviews the application. So I'll give you an example. If we received an application from Tarrant County, then the North Regional would review that application because they're the most familiar with that probation department and the interventions that probation department has available to them. They review the application, determine does that child meet any of our priority populations, and they mark those. Next, they just want to make sure, like, what interventions did this department ultimately provide for this child? Because that is something that we have to look at using RDA funding. Because we want to make sure that the probation department has provided something to this child before the state steps in. So for a department like Tarrant County is pretty large. It's one of our largest urban probation departments across the state. They're going to have a lot more intervention opportunities than, say, a much smaller probation department like Bandera County down in Central Texas. So we have to take that into consideration. So if it is a large department who's applied for RDA funding, then maybe the child's had a placement or two, and now they want to try something different. If it's a smaller department, those interventions will look very different. Maybe they provided some type of community intervention, possibly maybe a short term at a placement, but usually not. And that's okay, because we know that. We know that that probation department doesn't have the funding that a Tarrant or a Harris or a Dallas would have. And so we're willing to work with those probation departments to make sure that their kids get diverted as well. Next, we're going to look at the facility that the department is wanting to place the child, because one of the things that we do require in the application is a facility. So if you have a child who needs substance abuse treatment, we want to make sure that the facility that you're sending the child to provides substance abuse treatment. I know that sounds like, well, obviously, but it's not always obviously. And so we just want to make sure that everything is lining up, that it seems legitimate, that this child is actually, that this placement is going to make a difference for the child's life. And lastly, is the facility in the child's region? You know, very often we do have to place children outside of their home region, and that's because the services that they need don't exist in their region. One of the things that was so sad to me when we did this last regionalization plan back in February, and an exercise that we did in the first plan as well, was determining the gaps in service across the state. And I don't know about you, but Texas is huge. And each region looks very, very different. The south of Texas is very different from the north and panhandle regions, and central Texas looks very different from west Texas. So determining what's available out there is really difficult. But one thing that we do know is mental health services are lacking across the state. We have ultimately determined that mental health services, it's like a desert of mental health services other than Williamson County. I think was the only county in the entire state that had adequate mental health services for humans. And that's a problem. So those are the types of things that we're working on. One way that we're getting this information out to the probation departments is our facility handbook. This is going to be the third iteration of the handbook, and it was just published this September. In the handbook, it breaks down all of the placements that RDA funding uses when we place children, secure and non-secure. So this handbook has TJJD registered facilities as well as HHSC licensed facilities. And we make sure that we articulate that in the handbook so that people are aware of which facilities are secure and non-secure. We break it down by treatment need. So when you look at the handbook, if you're looking for sexual behavior treatment, you would go to the sexual behavior treatment section. And in that section, you would see all the facilities that our team has used for RDA to place a child. If you're looking for a facility in the central region, you would go to the central region tab, open it up, and there you would find all the facilities in the central region. The last way that we have divided it out is by special populations. Young youth, youth with IDD. These are youth that are really hard to place often. And so we do have a special section for those children as well as female youth. We also have a section for those kids. Our plan is to publish this handbook every 2 years. This last iteration of the handbook had something extra in it that had not been in it in the previous 2 iterations. It included performance measures. So now when you open up the handbook, if you flip all the way to the end of the facility overview, you will see a section that just talks about performance measures of that facility and what we've seen over the past 2 years to give outcomes, to let you know how often children successfully complete or unsuccessfully complete, how often a child gets committed after completing placement, things like that. And it's helpful for these probation departments across the state to know where should we place our children.
RDA isn't limited to the facilities in the handbook.
Oh, no. So if you have a child who has super special needs, it's a possibility that we don't even use the facilities that are in the handbook. That is an option as well. Very often, especially with mental health need, we have to tap into some of our mental health facilities. Those daily rates generally are a little bit more expensive, but that doesn't scare us. We would much rather place at a high-end mental health facility than to send the child to TJJD. So last but certainly not least, this is Dr. Palacios' contact information. I'm going to be real honest. This presentation was submitted prior to 9/1. As of 9/1, Dr. Palacios actually got a promotion. So she is the manager over community interventions and supports. And so she has her own team now that's working on all things community. But that doesn't mean that she doesn't work with the RDA team, because she does. She continues to review those applications and make sure that those children are receiving good placements. Here, I just wanted to highlight the entire regionalization team. As of this past week, we got our last member of the team. It was the final piece of the pie, and that was with Neil Edens in the Panhandle. He worked in the probation field for over 30 years, and we feel like he's going to be a wonderful addition to the team. So he is not included on this contact sheet because he just joined us last Monday, but everybody else is. So this will have all of your regionals information. So if you are a probation department and you have questions about regionalization, please do not hesitate to reach out to your local regional. And then Deborah Harris-Wiggins is also on this contact information. She now manages that team, but never hesitate to reach out to me. Regionalization will always kind of be my baby. I was a part of the team from the very beginning, and I'm just excited that I continue to get to have oversight over that program. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
If you could go to the microphone. Okay, Judge. Since you're first there, we'll go to Dr. Almeida.
Okay.
Okay.
So you mentioned that for a child to go to the regional or to an RDA through TJJD, as I understood it, they had to have a felony referral. So they're not required to have a felony adjudication, but just the referral?
That's the child has to have gone to court and been adjudicated for that offense.
All right, so I
absolutely
have to have a jury
no
trial.
problem.
To apply, they have to have the referral.
Sorry?
They can go ahead and apply for diversion with the
Yes.
referral.
Right,
But-
yeah.
But ultimately, it does have to be adjudicated.
That's why they were accepted, but he's not willing to plead to it, so we're going to have a jury trial. So.
Well, if you have any questions about that process, do not hesitate to reach out.
Hi, my name is Connie Almeida. So just a comment and a question. So really completely agree with the importance of trauma focus and starting early. And I know that you alluded to that in terms of special programs for pregnant teenagers that are involved in our system. And I really wish we did more about that in terms of, I know the department's done a great job in terms of TBRI and the training, but, what thoughts do you have, or what are you doing about that population that we know is so at risk? And so if we can intervene early with those babies that they're going to have, or young children. So what other services? I see that they are a priority population for the diversion, but just additional services for pregnant teenagers in the system or teenagers that have young children.
And
I don't know if this is on. Yes, okay.
to add to that question, where do they go would be another great.
What do you have for them?
Yeah, I think a lot of that, obviously, like you said, it starts off early, right? It starts in the school system. It starts in the community, being able to wrap those children up in the community when possible. That really is going to vary community to community across the state. I'm not sure what HHSC is doing in the local mental health authority.
But when they get to your system.
Oh, when they get to our system.
Yeah.
And that varies from department to department what they have to offer. For us, we have The only post-adjudication facility that I know that takes youth is Victoria County, that they will take pregnant youth. Other than that, I don't know of any in the state that do, that are post-adjudication facilities. I think we have found one more, and I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I think we had one other facility that would take a child. Once they get to a TJJD facility, if they are committed to a TJJD facility, there are a wealth of services that are offered there for them. And I don't work within the facility, so I can't speak to all of those specifically, but I know they do a lot of work on parenting or, whatever that child would need at that time. Because you're right, that is a very, very at-risk population, and it affects and all the kids that we work with, whether it be male or female, we're impacting generations to come by how we work with those kids. And I think especially if it's a child who already is parenting, and that's why it was so important to me, I really pushed to have that parenting for boys and girls, right? If you're parenting or expected to be parenting, it's so important that you understand those parenting skills that are needed. And if you are a parent, that you're able to have access to your child if you're a parenting child while they're in a facility. So when we have a child who is parenting, whether it be male or female, if they do end up in a placement and they have a child in the community, we try to make sure that that placement aligns with a location that's close to the child for visitations or things like that, and that relationship will be honored at that facility.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think one of the things that we might need to focus on a little bit more, and I've been doing this work for many, many years. In the early part of my career, actually in another state, we developed a lot of treatment foster care. And in addition to serving on the judicial, this commission, I also am on the advisory council for DFPS. So we're putting some efforts into developing treatment foster care, therapeutic foster care, treatment foster care homes. But, I think that's something maybe that we can explore again for this population. And I know that you have. There are some homes. But, again, giving these youth an opportunity to actually live in homes that provide treatment, especially for those that possibly have young children, we could place the children with their parents.
Yeah, most definitely. And all of our regional county program administrators do work closely with the DFPS liaisons in those regions. But I agree with you. I was a foster mom, and that is something that's very dear to my heart, is to making sure that those children who have not been able to be in that appropriate family, that they are able to be parented as best as possible. And those that are parenting can stay with their children when possible, for sure.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions?
Great questions. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Palacios and Ashley Kintzer.